Sego, it is Monday, July 2nd. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mistake healing, and no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tendenega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com. I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by my good friend Ed Schindler. I want to thank my studio engineer, Kelly McMillan, for our setup. And look, it's as always, we're happy to be here and happy to have a conversation, in spite of the fact that I had somebody ask me recently the other day, aren't you ever happy? Because it seems like I always have some sort of criticism or question to raise. I gotta tell you, I am not an unhappy person. By almost all accounts, I'm a pretty content person with my family and 9 grandkids and all of that stuff. But I will not be silent over what I think are abuses against our people or people in general. I just think there are so many people who are being oppressed still today, in the name of like old and sometimes ancient dogma and doctrine that just seems to pave the way. Sometimes these things have their foundation in faith-based religions. Sometimes these abuses are based on racism or again, all kinds of bigotry and biases that people have. So, look, I'm going to speak out about those things. That doesn't mean that I'm angry. It doesn't mean that I'm hateful or am mad at the world. I mean, I can say things like that jokingly, but no, I am not a miserable malcontent. But I will say that I will speak out against injustices. It's what I do. I mean, it's just what I built this platform for, was to promote conversations that would continue beyond this radio show, beyond this program, beyond each program. So that's the whole point of what we do here. So I am happy to be here. I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak to Native people and non-Native people about the issues that really affect all of us. But clearly this show is Let's Talk Native. So we're going to talk about Native culture. We're going to talk about Native language. We're going to talk about Native beliefs, our circumstances, our perspectives. We're going to talk about all that stuff. That's what we do. That's what we do with this program. So I just want to clear that up. No, I'm not an angry, unhappy guy. There are things that I'm unhappy with that I don't mind talking about. In fact, it's again, it's what I do. Look, I want to once again welcome Ed Schindler into our studio, onto the show. Ed, I want to thank you for coming in again.
Oh, yeah. Good morning.
Well, we had an interesting show last time, and we spoke about something that I felt like I had to address, which is this notion that everything before us has been mishandled, and that that somehow we're the only ones fighting for, quote unquote sovereignty, fighting for our rights and that kind of stuff. And I wanted to make it clear, there were some things in the past that people with far less quote unquote sophistication and tools for engagement and frankly in a far weaker position vis-a-vis the state and the federal government, and yet we had people in the past who stood up strongly. And the one area that I wanted to mention again today, especially because of the time of year and that kind of thing, was the clear and universal opposition, at least universal from a Haudenosaunee standpoint, opposition to the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. And the reason I bring that up is because as strong as our people stood against that act in 1924, we seem like we're okay with it now. And, I mean, I joked in the in the promo for the show that the fireworks have already started, but so who's celebrating their Independence Day this week? Because we know that even on our territories, we're going to see all kinds of red, white, and blue flags waving in the air. We're going to, in spite of the fact that the folks that came before us stood in stark opposition to this forced citizenship that was imposed upon us in 1924 when Congress declared that all Native people within the continental United States were hereby citizens. And of course, our people were clear. No, that's not the case. We're not citizens. We haven't agreed to that. We haven't consented to that, and we reject the notion. So, yet today, I guarantee, Ed, if we ride down 438 here on the Cattaraugus Territory of Seneca Nation, we're going to see many more American flags than any other kind of flag. I mean, you're going to see, at the Seneca Nation buildings, you're going to see maybe a Haudenosaunee flag, and you'll see a Seneca Nation flag. But you're going to see American flags. You're going to see POW, MIA flags. You're going to, and on, hanging out in front of somebody's yard, you're going to see American flags. You're going to see them. And, and I think about this, even in Standing Rock, when the warrior flag behind me here, when the warrior flag was flown in Standing Rock, there were some people who took offense to that and took exception to it. And I say warrior flag, but it's really the unity flag. That's what Louis Hall designed the image for. So when that flag was flown in Standing Rock, there were people who protested, including some folks from Onondaga who went out there, Joe Heath, the lawyer for Onondaga, and others. And yet, even though some wanted to take exception to that flag, around the headquarters for Standing Rock, there was 8 American flags flying. They have like a circle with 8 flagpoles, all American flags flying on it. They're fighting the United States. They're fighting one of the states, and yet they'll honor that flag. Hey, I've said it before. I'd like to follow suit with what some of the folks out in Hawaii did, where they took the flag down, and they hung. They took an American flag down, and they hung a Hawaiian flag, a Ganaka Maoli flag. They flew a flag that meant something to them. I'm not saying that we should take all the American flags down and we should burn them or anything like that. Not suggesting that, but I think the idea that within our native territories we've become so indoctrinated. And I say it collectively because obviously not all of us feel this way, but we collectively have become so indoctrinated that we've accepted this notion of patriotism. Look, I know we've got people who serve in the armed forces, and there's a variety of reasons why people do that. And I'm not even sure that patriotism is the main reason. I think it has to do more with a lack of opportunities and that kind of stuff. But I wanted to talk. I wanted to re-emphasize, especially the Citizenship Act, because our people, again, across the board, from the grassroots level to the to all the chiefs of the Confederacy, clan mothers of the Confederacy, they all stood up and said, no, we don't accept this. And yet today, we've ignored the fact that the people who faced the imposition at the time opposed it, and yet we just we're kind of oblivious to it. I mean, I got into a long debate on a thread involving Hawaii, where somebody was insisting, you're a what tribe are you? What American tribe are you? And then they said, you must be a Canadian tribe. And I said, no, I'm not a tribe. I'm not a member of a tribe. I'm Gunyagahaga. I'm Ongoyongwe. That's who I am. And they want to put you in a box, and that box is defined by the federal government. So, I look, they have used in the American system so many ways of separating us, marginalizing us, minimizing our collective, I don't know, philosophies, I guess. And I say collective because I don't want to create a pan-Indian sense for who we are as Ongoyongwe, as Native people. But there is something that binds us all together, and yet it's the federal government and the Canadian governments that have done everything they could to separate us. So, I mean, I wanted to address that, and we'll talk. We've got an hour. We'll have time to talk about a number of these things. But I guess the one thing, especially, I mean, you made me think of it a little bit more with you rejoining the program. How much some of the people, and I don't want to just say elders, because that's just a universal term that gets used almost like it becomes meaningless almost, because you say that and it's like this nebulous idea that just old folks said it. But there were specific people in titled positions that had responsibilities to represent us, who were very articulate. They documented their opposition. And they were very clear. They traveled to Washington and spoke it directly there. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in 1924, our people opposed this declaration of citizenship that was being imposed upon us. Which I gotta say, even in 1924, the notion of denationalizing a people was already being talked about as a war crime. Coming out of 1913, it was already that was language that was being spoken by international diplomats. This notion of denationalizing a people was being spoken of as a war crime. By 1945, coming out of World War II, it was clear that the international community regarded the denationalization of a people and the imposition of somebody else's the character or nation's character on a people. I mean that it fit in there with ethnic cleansing and genocide and all that stuff. But the idea, this notion of denationalization, is today it is considered a war crime. So in 1924, our people opposed it, rejected it out of hand. Yet between 1924 and where we are today, less than 100 years later, we are pretty complicit and complacent on the subject. I don't know, Ed. What's your thoughts on this? Because you've lived here in Cattaraugus territory your whole life, so you've probably witnessed. I mean, what would you say from your life as a young man to now? Was there more opposition to this when you were younger, or do you think it was already, had its effect on people when you were growing up?
The biggest thing that happened was not so much that they didn't want to be Americans, as much as the people felt that our people already had what we needed. Okay? And the need was to remain as a community, in a community that extended generations ahead, and that we took care of that as a responsibility as a people and community. And that was very different from what the United States was. The United States was a business, and the business was to basically exploit anyone they could. We wanted nothing to do with that because of the culture. The culture focused on the young people and the coming generations. And that's what the so-called elders were looking for, was to take care of them. And you take a look at the past 94 years, as you talk about, and it started before that. It started in the 1840s when they created the Thomas Indian School and tried to take away our language, our culture, and the way we dressed, everything. They even cut the hair and tried to forcefully assimilate the young people, the children, into being Americans.
I mean, although the Thomas Indian School was not a part of the national residential school system, nor the one that existed on the Canadian side. The Thomas Indian School was fairly independent from the rest of that. Kill the Indian, save the men, but it still had the same. It was still doing the same thing. It was doing the same thing about indoctrination and assimilation. Its focus, just like the U.S. residential schools. And Thomas Indian School had its full dosage of religion, just like all of those other
Yes.
residential schools, which relegated the civilizing of our people, and I say that with air quotes, I guess, to churches. They let religious leaders try to change who we are with an overdose of Bible, and of course very, very strict and abusive treatment. But you're right, but I think it's worth mentioning that the Thomas Indian School, although it wasn't a part of that national system, it had the exact same characteristics.
Right. And it was also one of the beginnings of it.
Well,
the
yeah,
Thomas
it
Indian
was at the
School.
front end of it. There's no question about that. The Thomas Indian School was one of the early ones. It wasn't the first, and it certainly wasn't the last, but it was certainly one of the at the beginning of it. But no, I mean. But so I mean, when you talk about coming into 1924, obviously the level of indoctrination and assimilation that was happening, not just with Thomas Indian School. Let's not forget that
Yes.
we had many of our people that were being sent to the Mush Hole on the Canadian side.
Right.
Many of people who were going to Carlisle Indian School, out to Haskell, and all these other places. Our people were being scattered just like other Native people were. We just happened to have one of the residential schools right here on territory, But knowing, what kind of the condition that our territories may have been in 1924, the idea that in spite of that condition, that our territories universally rejected that. So again, fast forward from 1924 to the 50s and the 60s when you or I were children.
Yeah.
And you were living here specifically. My father was an iron worker, so I was all over the place. But you were living right here.
Yes.
And when you growing up, I mean, did you feel like this territory was already becoming very quote unquote Americanized, or not yet?
It was very Americanized, because if you were to look at history, when the U.S. went through their Great Depression, it didn't hit us. Because the people were still gardening, and they were still hunting, and they were still making their own clothing and things like that, where the economy of the United States was not something that was depended on by the people here. And so therefore, people weren't losing fortunes and all that stuff, because they didn't live off from the fortunes. They lived off from working together to produce food, homes.
But again, that's before the Citizenship Act. So at the time,
that was after also, because it was after.
But I'm saying the Great Depression was kind of coming out of that already. So
the people were still living the old way.
Yeah, and that's my point, and I think that's why we can reject it. But by the time you're talking about the 60s and the 70s, you're suggesting that that our territories had already become were beginning to be inundated with Americana and that kind of thing.
It was in the Supreme Court when they got rid of segregation, because they shut down the schools on the reservation and sent us to Gowanda and Silver Creek.
Yeah, so Brown versus the Board of Education, that was part of where
we had to learn the state curriculum. We didn't learn anything about our people. We didn't learn anything about the history, culture,
language. Yeah, but we weren't
language.
learning that in residential schools either. Not that all of our kids were going there.
We were learning it from the elders.
Well, but again, so why would the fact that these residential schools would have been necessarily shut down because of the Brown versus the Board of Education and that kind of thing? Why would our kids necessarily have stopped receiving that education from the elders then? I mean, I just don't understand even that conversation, because if going, regardless of whatever school we went to, whether it was a Thomas Indian School or any of the residential schools, we were still getting inundated with their belief systems, not ours. You're saying that after that that Supreme Court decision, did somehow our people rely more so on that education off territory and provide less of it into?
Yes, we became assimilated because the schools were mandatory. And if you didn't send your children to school, you could lose the children. So the people sent the kids to school.
Well, and to that point, if you read the Everett report, which is which kind of lays out even the dispute that was existing between the New York State Indian Commission and the Federal Indian Commission, which were these two agencies who made it their their business to discuss our lives, almost like we weren't a part of it, right? But one of the issues that was presented by the federal government was this idea of turning us into U.S. citizens. That was before the citizenship. This is 1920, and in that Everett report, they talked about how the New York State Commission said we can't force citizenship upon those people. But part of the reason that the federal government was suggesting it was there were three main issues that was discussed in the Everett report. Education was one of them. The idea that we weren't sending our kids to their schools.
Their schools, yes.
So that was, and they didn't want to try to enforce truancy laws already existed by then. So they were already not sure what to do about Native kids not going to school. So that was, again, one of the reasons the federal government said, well, if we made them citizens, this whole jurisdictional issue could be resolved by which kind of shows the ulterior motive here. So there was education. There was also the fact that the federal government was supposed to have stepped up for health services, and a lot of that was falling on the state. And then the federal government was fine just letting it go that way. Even some of the quote unquote payments associated with certain treaties, the state was paying them, and the federal government wasn't. So that was part of the issue between the state and the federal government. But between the health service issues, the truancy, and of course jurisdictional issues in general, those were the three main issues that the federal government thought would be solved simply by making us U.S. citizens. And of course, like I said, at that time, it didn't go over very well. But you're saying by the time you're looking at the 70s, there's already and would you say think about the civil rights movement that goes on during the 60s into the 70s. Do you think that perhaps Native people got caught up into that and adopted some sense of American constitutional rights through that struggle? Do you think that may have had influence as well?
Well, I can speak for myself. I didn't get caught up in the civil rights movement. I got caught up in finding out what would I be fighting for. And I got talking to a lot of people who could answer those questions. And as I went through school, I started asking the teachers some of those questions. They didn't know the answers. And I started asking, why aren't you teaching us about us? And that was a big question none of them could answer.
Well, it's interesting because, the thing about the civil rights movement, and I oftentimes quote this, and it's not really a quote, it was more of a conversation that Martin Luther King had with Harry Belafonte, as a matter of fact, just before he passed, before he was assassinated. Martin Luther King had confided in Harry Belafonte and said, I fear that I am integrating my people into a burning house. So in spite of him being one of the foremost, prominent voices for civil rights for black people, and people of color, he began to question what he was fighting for. So it's interesting that what you're saying is you didn't know where your place would have been in that civil rights battle because you're not sure what. Again, I kind of where we're at now. We wouldn't have been fighting for the same thing that other people were fighting for.
Right. We wanted to be able to identify the self, and we had some resources that didn't exist. We had land base, we had a history, we had a culture, we had language, but they were being taken away from us. And the thing was, we didn't want to, at the time that it was happening in 1924, we didn't want to lose those things because it was looked at as our future. It wasn't something that was just,
So it still remains pretty much difficult, then, I would say, to determine where that turning point actually was from our people rejecting out of hand this notion of imposed U.S. citizenship to this idea that, we're just kind of okay with it. We don't. I mean, from a Seneca person standpoint, is it difficult for you to get a sense for where that turning point began, where our people became complacent, if not complicit, with this notion of imposed citizenship?
I can.
I know you can only speak for yourself, but
speaking
you got
for
an
myself,
observation, though, is my point.
I studied very well, and that's one of the reasons why I could debate with the teachers, especially history and culture teachers. Okay. And the questions that I presented to them was regarding the history, what they taught as their history and how obscure and basically made up it was, and how they didn't even teach about us in a present tense. It was all past tense, literally hundreds of years ago. And that I would
still
question.
teach it that way.
Yeah, I would
that
question,
way
why
today.
are you teaching it that way? We're right here. And that they kept claiming that's how the curriculum is done. And that's what, I mean, I remember there was a group of us who wouldn't stand for the pledge to the flag, and we were all told that we have to. I said, we don't have to.
Well, and you say that, but even today, while I think teachers and school administrators are hard pressed to force that issue, our children are still being very much, if not coerced, but they're certainly being pressured to do that and to comply and to conform. And nobody's ever explained to a child, from a school standpoint, the lack of a full blown requirement for them to do such a thing. And in fact, remembering the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag or the national anthem used to be something you were graded on. Even I mean, and it was probably still happening to some extent.
Yes.
So,
and that was one of the things that I remember just changing and saying, I will pledge allegiance when it's one nation under, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I will whenever, but you're not, so therefore I don't.
When there is liberty and justice for all, that'd be a Colin Kaepernick kind of view.
Yeah, and the other thing that's not mentioned, it's not taught in the school system, K through 12, and that's that with the Haudenosaunee, the United States is based on the Haudenosaunee, okay? The Soviet Union there was a anthropologist, Engels, who wrote, and Marx read the book. He wrote an anthropologist book about the Six Nations, and Marx read it, and then Marx and Lenin set up the Communist Party in Soviet Union, what was then Russia. And it was based on
just communism. Yeah,
it was based on the Haudenosaunee. And then after World War II, they sent out groups of people to study and find out what could humankind do to prevent that from ever happening again.
What from ever happening again?
That warfare, world warfare. And that's how they set up the United Nations. It was first set up in San Francisco, and they had found basically the tree of peace, the Haudenosaunee, and they set up the United Nations based upon that, where the people would come together to resolve issues instead of fighting and thinking that would resolve them. But they don't teach that within the U.S. curriculum.
Teach the fact that what would first the League of Nations and the United Nations as an effort to prevent war. It's like areas of the globe have been in a constant state of military conflict ever since, which is, it kind of shows. I'm not saying the failure of the United Nations, but the nature of of oppression that comes from governments. Hey, look, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue on this thread, because I'm just curious at how we get to the place that we're at, and how do we engage a conversation that involves our autonomy or decolonization, which is a popular expression now, knowing where we're at and knowing and trying to assess how we got here. But we'll talk about it when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native.
your children in the classroom. English history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Little white lies, little white lies, little white lies, little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Say your lies don't hurt nobody. Only meant to know yourself. All the white lies only get bigger. Start to lie to yourself. We learn to respect our elders. The knowledge, wisdom, and pride. And don't turn your back just 'cause they're older. No, no.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. I got Ed Schindler in studio. Before we get back into it, and we talked off, while during the break, and kind of came to one of those obvious duh moments. But I'll get into it in a minute. But first, let me go ahead and thank my sponsor. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises. I want to thank Legacy 420 in Tandanega. Mike General and Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium. I want to thank individuals who help out from time to time when they can. Folks like my friend here, Ed Schindler, who contributes to the show. My friend Cynthia Trice and Roger Jock, Neville Spring, and many others who not only support the program today, but many who have supported the program in the past that have allowed us to now enter our ninth year doing Let's Talk Native. And of course, we've done it on commercial radio, and now we're doing it on our own from our own studios here. But we wouldn't have been able to do it without the support from even those people who've helped in the past. So I want to thank all of you for doing your part and joining in the fight and helping us to continue to educate, entertain, and inform for all these years. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache RadioNet for providing our streaming. And again, thank CKWE for the simulcast and rebroadcast, as well as our internet partners, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio, and many others who, at very least, allow us to post our show on your group pages. Even if you don't have a full-blown internet network, you allow us to post our show on your group pages, and that allows this conversation to be shared in many ways, and hopefully continue on. So I want to thank all of you for that. Yeah, when we're trying to determine where it was that there was such a stark change, you mentioned it, and it kind of seems obvious to me now. When you talk about World War II,
right,
with the amount of people who enlisted for a variety of reasons, again, to serve in the military in all of its branches, I think the sense of patriotism that our people had when they came back, not only experiencing fighting on the side of the Americans, and again, let's face it, this whole idea that this was the good generation. This was the good fight. This was, unlike some fights in the past where it's hard to know who the good guys and the bad guys are. Think about the Civil War and even World War I was, you could question whether the Germans were really the cause of that or not. But certainly World War II, it was so easy for everybody to say, oh yeah, there's the good guys and then there's the bad guys, and the Axis powers, the original axis of evil, as they were called, Italy and under Mussolini, and Japan under Hirohito, and of course Germany under Adolf Hitler. They were the bad guys, and everybody else had to be good. Even the Russians were on the good side, right? The Russians were kind of the good guys, right?
Well,
so this idea that Native people, would serve side by side with with Americans, it rubbed off. I mean, of course, even the people back home had to really have this idea that, oh, our men are doing a just thing by enlisting in the armed forces. Because, and I think it's also worth noting that in spite of the Citizenship Act, our people protested this idea of drafting our people during the World War II as well. But yeah, I think the obvious thing is that our people came back with a brand new sense of identity. And obviously our people have been enlisting in the armed forces at very high rates, including World War I, but certainly after World War II. We come out of that with this sense of, the code talkers and heroizing that whole effort. And this is by no means to negate the bravery that it took to be involved in something in such a broad-based military conflict, world conflict that was going on. But it would change. It probably would be World War II that would have changed that whole sense of identity. And part of the thing, and we talked about during the break, is that it was also a time that for the first time our men probably didn't experience the same level of racism that they experienced back home. Because when all these guys put on a uniform, look, racism still existed, even in the military. But it was, when you got into the throes of trying to, fight for a common cause, just or otherwise, and you're standing side by side with somebody fighting what is now a common enemy, it changes the relationship you have. I mean, even the code talking, which in many ways was kind of a racist thing in of itself. It was the exploitation of our language, essentially the militarization of our language to use as a tool, a military tool, a weapon, if you will. It weaponized our language, so especially against the Japanese, so communications would not be intercepted and that code wouldn't be broken because they're using language that would be essentially or based on a language that was obscure to the Japanese. But our people, even as code talkers, were oftentimes pressed into service. They were forced into service. Sometimes by charges they were laid at the local police level or whatever else. But even those guys who served as code talkers, they actually had a minder whose job it was to make sure that a code talker was not captured. And when I say to see to it that they weren't captured, there was two choices: either to defend and help fight to make sure that a code talker would not be captured, or put a bullet in that code talker so they would not be taken alive. I mean, that kind of shows you that even in the throes of war, standing side by side, fighting, the Band of Brothers thing. Yeah, that Band of Brothers was sometimes shaky. Now, that was an experience, throughout the entire military. But I would say that relationship with such a large number of Native people serving in the U.S. military in something that becomes, for all intents and purposes, the modern era, that must have changed things. It must have had a dramatic effect on how our people began to identify themselves.
Yes, that also led into not just the American Indians, but all people basically got swept into America. I mean, you couldn't be even hesitating to be American during the 50s, or the FBI would literally come down on you.
Well,
Okay?
yeah, the whole again, the Red Scare that would
Yes.
come,
In the Cold
House
War.
Un-American Act and the Cold War, but also immigration would continue to be a pretty much an open door receiving people during that time.
Keep in mind, it was during that decade that the United States started, terminating Native Americans. Okay? So the people here in Cattaraugus and rest of Haudenosaunee, they did things which were not going to create that problem.
Would not bring it to a head where they would be faced with that.
Because
that
if we
alternative,
basically took a stand that we weren't American, you don't know what they would have done.
That's true.
Okay? And you end up in their schools studying their concept
there's
of
a line
history.
from a song. I oftentimes quote this. There was a band called Mike and the Mechanics. I don't know if you ever remember that. Remember that? But there was a line that says, "Teach your children quietly, because someday sons and daughters will rise up and fight where we stood still."
Yes.
And that line in that song makes me think that, sometimes you have to, kind of get along to live to fight another day.
Yes.
And the fact of the matter is, and this is kind of what brings this conversation that we're having here, we are in a stronger position to resist the state and federal government today.
Today, yeah.
Even though we had all the same arguments we could have made before, but now because of the internet and social media and so many ways to show injustice, especially coming out of the civil rights era and that kind of stuff, it makes it very, very difficult for the United States to be as oppressive as they are when somebody shines a light on it. They still do it, but I'm just saying it gives us more opportunity to speak out. That's why we play a role in producing film and radio and we have access to media that we never had before. But it's interesting. Yeah, I think if you were to try to put a point on it, or a turning point, I would think that the large level of military enlistment probably played a big role in, and I guess you still see it. I mean, obviously every one of our territories has an American Legion.
Yes.
Or not every one of our territories, but many of them do. We have a large number of veterans, and not just of still of World War II, but veterans of Korea, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. Let's face it, the United States is always at war somehow, and so we still have. I don't know if our enlistment rate is as high today as it was in previous generations, but I think part of the enlistment that still exists. I mean, I've heard people do stories on NPR. Oh, it's because enlisting in the armed forces allows Native people to live out their warrior culture, and I'm thinking, no, that's a bunch of crap. It's really because in the absence of an emotional conflict like World War II was. And a very recognizable, global threat that that people could perceive, the Mussolini and Hirohito and Hitler. It was really easy to get emotionally involved and thinking, no, we all have to stand up and protect the innocent and the underdog, so to speak. But But I think we've had such a high level of enlistment, and I think that went hand in hand with American indoctrination, and so here we are today. and I get we're kind of running to the top of the hour already. But today, I think there are a lot of Americans that are questioning, and not just because of Donald Trump. I think this is the sense of nationalism and and the racism that is now become even more and more to the surface. It's been more normalized, so to speak. And because of that, I think people are really questioning this idea of what is American values. I mean, it's like I was saying over the last couple of weeks, when people say, oh, stripping children away from parents at the border, that's un-American. And I had to say, well, not so much. I mean, that's kind of an American thing to do that. I mean, they've been doing it. They did it to black kids. They did it to Native kids. They've done it to Japanese kids. I mean, let's face it, the idea of locking up children and in many cases stripping them from their families is not, it if it's un-American, it's been the most broad-based un-American act that a country could ever be involved in. Let's put it that way. But I think today, and Trump is part of the reason, but certainly the way things are going today, I think people are really questioning this notion of independence and celebrating this uber patriotic holiday.
There's one other thing people should realize, and that's that a lot of people woke up in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, toward the end of the civil rights effort. And people started identifying as Native American again, okay, who were...
Even some that weren't.
Right, even some that weren't, because they could identify with what was being protected. There was a land base with perks on the land base that didn't exist other places.
Well, and I think there was this notion of a native philosophy, even though much of that was assumed. But you're right. I think a lot of people got drawn to this idea of again, what got labeled as the American Indian movement and the sovereignty movement. We all of a sudden we had people that were fighting for our autonomy, and that didn't. I don't think our people did that much. I mean, they might have stood up against, again, the things like the Citizenship Act and that kind of stuff. But it was more that was an imposition. But all of a sudden, people were trying to assert who we are. Our people kind of lived quiet and humble lives, and only rose up when we were threatened. But coming out of the civil rights era, we also said, wait a second. We've got some racism issues. Our people didn't stand up against racism that much. I mean, we kind of accepted what it was and found a way to keep ourselves intact. But I think you're right. We started pushing back in the 70s.
Started pushing back, but we weren't pushing to become part of them.
Right. We weren't pushing for constitutional rights and to become equal, or we were looking for American equality.
Right.
We were still, coming out of the 70s, we were pushing for autonomy and distinction, which is one of the things that always kept us a little bit separated from that civil rights. We were fighting for our human rights, not for our civil rights within the United States system. And that was a different thing altogether.
And the thing that happened starting basically in the 70s especially is the opportunity to go to the universities and start studying beyond 12th grade. And that's where you could find out some things that occurred historically that weren't taught. They were
but even that was difficult, because let's face it, I mean, for the most part, for Native people to pursue secondary and higher education, they already had to have done fairly well within the public school system. We weren't attending a whole lot of private schools at that point.
No.
And so in doing so, to succeed in that system, you oftentimes involves an awful lot of indoctrination. What I've seen with some of our people who are the most educated is they can also become the contrarians back home. When they get back, they say, oh, I've gotten educated, so now let me tell you how it's really supposed to be. And so while some have been enabled to broaden their horizons and see things with a broader view and understand what our fight is in relative to other struggles throughout history and today, that it wasn't always the case. So sometimes our people say, "Oh, I just learned a whole new way, so now let me be a part of the indoctrination system." I mean,
yeah.
Am I right? I mean, that's what we do experience with some of the people who come back, fully engaged in that education system.
Right. When I went to the University of Buffalo, okay, I majored in Native American Studies, and I studied very precisely the Haudenosaunee. And that meant I went to the Longhouse and talked to some of the elders. The women especially were very helpful. They were willing to share what they knew. And that wasn't just here in Seneca Nation, whether it was Tonawanda, whether it was up in Mohawk, whether it was Onondaga, throughout the whole Six Nations. The people who were taking care of that, they were very willing to share what they knew. And I thought that was very good, because that's what I majored in. I didn't major in mathematics. I was, really, I was really doing really well in mathematics.
Isn't it kind of crazy to think that that it would be secondary, university education that would
Yeah.
that's where you would have to get some of this information because
Yes.
our systems back home had already broken down to some extent. I mean, that's essentially what you're saying in a way.
Yeah, it wasn't as it was,
Yeah.
which isn't necessarily good, but it's not something that we had lost.
Well, and I think that's the point that we always talk about. And I used to say, we haven't lost our ways, but we've lost our way.
Our will.
Well, because I don't think we've realized the value in bringing some of that stuff back, which is kind of where we always come back to with the sense of identity and trying to. I mean, look, when we want to talk about things like decolonization, well, what's that really going to mean? I mean, when I look through a lot of our territories, and again, I hate to pick on Standing Rock all the time, but I mean, the thing that is worth noting is that Barack Obama goes out to Standing Rock and celebrates with Dave Archambault, their chief and or chairman, whatever he was, and on a Flag Day celebration right up in Cannonball, right up at the site of this standoff essentially, and gives a speech about what they're going to do, that they need to build, quoting Sitting Bull. Well, we need to build something for the future of our kids, our children, and then proposes a pipeline. So I mean, you think about where we struggle with this relationship with the United States and struggle with our own sense of identity and how we stand. Not just against the United States. I mean, look, our fight isn't with the United States. Our fight is for something, not against them. Our fight is for who we are and to maintain a level of autonomy and distinction. And, again, the word sovereignty has become one of those words that we appropriated for our own use. But it may not be the right word, because sovereignty is about power and authority, where I think the real crux of our autonomy and our distinction should be based on being a free people. And I think that is, being free is more important than having somebody recognize my power. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's the conversation that when we move forward and we do try to figure out, okay, what is our place and what is it that we need to fight for going forward? I think that's one of the challenges. I think that's what we have to seriously think about that.
I think one of the things that would be helpful, okay, probably not just for our people, but for any people, it doesn't matter, and that is how do we develop an economy which doesn't depend on corporations to be basically exploiting both us and the environment? How do we do that? Can it be done within our lifetime?
Well,
and if not,
even
what
just
can we
an
do?
economy, but a lifestyle.
A
How
lifestyle.
do we develop a lifestyle that is not based on, it's funny you say that, because in my notes here before the show, I saw somebody quote on here that the foundation of racism is capitalism. Capitalism, which has to do with property and owning stuff, is kind of where not just classism, but racism is found. So if you're going to fight racism, then you need to fight capitalism, because they are linked. And so what people want to talk about, the free market, and they want to talk about capitalism, we know that's been one of the things that's damaged our people. It's damaged our territories. So when you talk about trying to develop a lifestyle that gets us back to that place, and I don't mean literally going back in time, where when an economic collapse like the Great Depression hits, we aren't so adversely affected by it. I mean, that's kind of where we have to think. When we want to talk about decolonization, that's what we need. I know we use words like food sovereignty and all that other stuff, but I think we're kind of, and we should be reminded of this with every one of their holidays that we get inundated with, especially when they commercialize it with, the next President's Day sale or the Memorial Day sale or the 4th of July sale for every damn thing. I mean, this is the thing that we should really think about is, where do we fit in, and where should we choose to take different steps that would affect what our lifestyles are and what a lifestyle might be that could be somewhat independent of their capitalist system.
I remember over in California, I was talking with a group of people. They were talking about how do we address racism? How do we get rid of racism? And I told them that you're not going to get rid of racism until you get rid of the concept of race. And I explained to them that within our language, there is no concept of race. There is no concept of what
But
they
we can
have.
argue whether race really exists or not.
Right.
We know that it's a construct that came out, didn't it even just come out of Europe. It actually became something that that was utilized to control people,
Right.
and make sure that that slaves, and that included Native people and Black people, would not fraternize too much with white people who were also either indentured servants or
Yes.
living a quality of life that wasn't much better than the slave livelihood. So they wanted to make sure they kept that separate, and the race became the easy. I mean, it's such an identifier. I mean, especially if you're going to say race is based on skin color.
No.
But yeah, we could argue, genetically and biologically, that race is not a real thing. But
Right.
getting rid of that concept of race, still, there's always some other way to classify people and create classifications of people, and that's what people do to separate us and keep people. That's why the world is in a constant state of some sort of
Yes.
military conflict all the time. Yeah, I mean, at all times. But anyway, so. A couple of days, there's a whole lot of people who are going to be celebrating the 4th of July and Independence Day. And I guess the question is that Americans are increasingly starting to ask themselves, are they really independent? I mean, when you consider, the freedoms that are always at risk. It's interesting that when you talk about a holiday like 4th of July and the patriotism that is promoted and propagandized with that there's a law that came through after 9/11 called the USA Patriot Act, that's really an acronym which really allows the government to access your personal information, to spy on you. And that started during George W. Bush's administration, but stayed fully intact during the entire Obama administration, and of course would stay intact for the Trump administration. So this idea of freedoms and independence, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that as this trade war heats up, we're going to see how independent the United States really is, I guess.
Right.
Well, anyway. Well, I hope people enjoy their day off anyway, and hope nobody gets hurt by fireworks. And we'll see you back here on Friday. I will be in New York on Thursday, so you can catch my Let's Talk show on WBI in New York by tuning into WBI.org, or I'll Facebook stream that show as well. So you can join me and Shawnee Rice in New York on Thursday from 10 till noon. Until then, we'll see you. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler, and this is Let's Talk Native. Nyaweh.
Nyaweh.